Hi, good to be here, Brandon, and hi everyone at the Minnesota Blockchain Summit, right?
Yeah, the Minnesota Blockchain Initiative, and this is an event that's paired
Mm-hmm.
with St. Thomas Law Journal, St. Thomas School of Law Journal here in Minneapolis. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, great to be here. My name is Niklas. I'm originally from Germany. Have a background as an entrepreneur, and I'm now the founder and general partner of Infinita VC. That's a venture capital fund that invests in startups that can utilize startup societies and network states.
So, do you invest in the infrastructure of these societies themselves, or in the technology behind them, or maybe that's kind of one and the same?
Yeah, no, it's not the same. That's an important distinction, right? So there's other VCs who invest in that infrastructure or who invest in like concrete projects. Pronamos Capital, for example, invested in like Prospera or Afropolitan or Praxis. These are the projects. And there's other VCs such as Tom Howard, Network Zero VC, who was looking, although he pivoted away from investing in network state infrastructure. Right? I don't do either of those. I'm investing in companies that are in very regulated industries such as healthcare and biotech or air mobility that can gain significant advantages from the opening of that frontier from startup societies. Right. So I invested in two Prospera-based companies or companies that have operations in Prospera. Minicircle, that's a gene therapy company, or AreaLoop, which is a drone logistics company. So they get a lot of upside from Prospera, and I want to help create more of these startup societies that can help more of these startups. So I don't only invest in startups that are already there, but generally in a bigger space of startups for whom it could be an interesting or useful strategic optionality.
Okay. So there's a business case for these startup societies, but let's put them in the context of this, well, just a layperson's understanding of them. And then specifically with this event, this morning we had a panel and a keynote speech on the idea of Web3 reshaping, improving governance especially in the corporate world, but also in other arenas. And then following this talk, we're going to talk with, or we're going to see a presentation on how the U.S. government is trying to address these new technologies, how to best regulate them. But this is something where I almost see it as a blend of those two, where you're coming up with innovative ways to govern, not necessarily retrofitting them onto an existing government, although that does happen, like with Palau, which maybe you can address. But this is like a brand new way of creating a society. That's why they're called startup societies. So maybe just talk a little bit about what is a startup society.
Sure. So startup societies are generally projects that involve a community, right? So they have members. They often involve having physical territory, right? Sometimes they have a degree of jurisdiction, right? So Prospera, for example, is in a special economic zone, right? So they have a high degree of legal autonomy. But that's not always the case. There's also examples such as Cabin, which has Neighborhood Zero in Austin, right? So they have a bit of less legal autonomy, but they're operating just outside of the metropolitan area of Austin, where they have fewer housing regulations. So startup societies kind of seek their own sort of legal or jurisdictional space to build a community. So these startup societies address some of these specific needs. Other startup societies, some of which are not yet public, but they like charter cities in like California or Texas that, for example, work around like hardware or energy. All right, so these can also be considered startup societies in that they're kind of have sort of they're seeking to build kind of a new space, a community in that space, and sort of bring a key moral or technological innovation to that they want to advance. So that's a primer on startup societies, and I named a couple of examples that your audience may or may not yet be familiar with. But I think the best examples really is Prospera. This is based in a special economic zone in Honduras that I think you visited. And there you kind of have the full stack, right? So they're creating kind of a new legal system there, a new legal and governance system that's broadly based on best practices of common law, right? So 19th century British common law and US common law, best practices from Hong Kong, from Dubai, and sort of use that as a basis for a legal system. So when it comes specifically for the crypto Web3 or the financial industry, they would be saying that they don't regulate that as much before it goes to market. They're regulating more what happens when somebody frauds someone or commits a crime. But at the same time, Prosper also does regulations in a way to create interoperability with other jurisdictions, right? So they have regulatory bodies that are often voluntary and that you can adopt as a business to reduce your liability, right? So this is, I think, a very particular innovation in that one startup society that could be very relevant and interesting for your audience to engage with, because I think it's very important and very much needed in the crypto Web3 space to have those kinds of jurisdictional options.
Yeah, it sounds like there's, like in the case of Prosper and perhaps others, that you mentioned two use cases, especially broadly, companies that have a lot of red tape in their home country. I guess in both the developing and the developed world, is what you just described. So whether it's a med tech company that wants to have more flexibility with what they can experiment with, you might have some Western involvement or developed country or investment, but then Hondurans themselves. So people from the developing nation looking for a physical place, in the case of Prospera, to to flourish, to be able to have a better life. Are both of those coming together then in a place like Prospera?
Yes, they're coming together, but it's important to keep in mind unleashing economic development in Honduras is the first and most important mandate of Prospera. Right? If Prospera fails at that, they won't stay here, right, as a guest, right? That's the whole purpose of the special economic zones, which is why we're here. And also in practice, Hondurans make up about 70 to 80% of residents that live on the ground. In fact, I'm in Honduras mainland right now, and I've done meetups with the local Ethereum and crypto communities, right? So many of them have visited, some have started businesses there, and they're benefiting a lot from sort of that access to these formal institutions, but also that there's kind of a community that's forming, right? So I made the first VC investment in a Honduran, institutional VC investment in a Honduran tech startup, for example, right? So this is the most important part of our mission here. But, the whole point of these zones is to combine local talent with access to international investment, right? International talent, right? Which is why I'm here. So it does effectively combine these two, yes.
But that's just one example of other of many kinds of startup societies. So I'm looking right now at your infographic, Startup Societies Landscape 3.0.
Right, so you see several examples here. So startup cities, I call the ones that have an amount of jurisdiction, that have physical territory, right? So Prospera and Ciudad Morazan are in Honduras. There's others in Africa here that are private cities, also special economic zones, charter cities. Small farm cities is like micro farming communities. So these are like examples where they effectively subunits of existing states. There's one interesting case that I would point out, which I put in infrastructure, but it also has their own jurisdiction. So it's kind of an interesting edge case. The Catawba Digital Economic Zone is based on an Indian reservation, right? So Indian reservations have a high degree of legal autonomy, right, which they've been using for like casinos or cannabis. And the Catawba Digital Economic Zone is specifically addressing the crypto industry, right? So they're building a digital domicile to incorporate companies just like Delaware, just with a clearer set of regulations around digital assets, meaning crypto, stable coins, and banking. So this calls to be a very interesting use case for your community and the attendees of this conference.
And then you were touching on network states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so these are cloud-based communities. They don't have physical jurisdiction yet, but they aim to have one, right? So they are not land first, but they're not land never, right? So I think the ones that have gotten most attention are Afropolitan and Praxis, right? So Praxis is negotiating a deal with the government in the Mediterranean, and Afropolitan is aiming to build Afro towns and embassies, right? They aim to have like a national ID passport for an online cloud nation of diaspora Africans that is internationally recognized and that can have like representation in the form of embassies, right? So just to allow Africans to have better passport, to be able to travel more, to get to safety when there's like a conflict, such as happened in Ukraine, for example. So these are, I think, the best examples to point out.
Are we seeing an alternative to the nation state, or are these just supplements to existing countries as you see them?
Yeah, so these are supplements, right? So none of them are, they're saying we're competing for governance, right? But none of them is saying like we're a sovereign nation, right? So except for Liberland, again, that's an exception. It's also controversial. The other ones are saying, hey, nation states and governments, they are not delivering the best product or service, right? Let's unbundle it and let's aim to provide a better product in a very specific aspect, right? But they're not saying like we're a sovereign nation or country or whatever. None of them are.
What explains the rise of these? Is it the technology is there now, the connectivity of the internet, blockchain technology that allows it to happen, or is it, or is it that people just aren't super happy with their existing home country, and so they want to find a better way to organize a society?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of those. I think many nations and governments are just simply too big, right? So they have the same sort of local monopoly effects that big companies have that have an effective monopoly, right? So there's a bit of an unbundling happening, right? So some of the big ones just have administrative problems and failure, right? To me personally, that became very apparent during the COVID pandemic, right? There was just no effective state capacity to respond to a crisis. And the idea of the startup society is that there can be a smaller, more effective size that provides better services in very specific aspects, right? So, and I think that's also coupled with, I think COVID was a big trigger, increasing like restrictions around travel or generally increasing restrictions on civic life, right? And also there's an increasing feeling of overreach, right? So especially in the crypto industry, there's an increasing like, hey, we want to build a great technology that makes the world a better place and build a better financial system. So we feel like the bias by much of the Biden administration or some U.S. senators and like Elizabeth Warren is unfair, right? And that effectively driving innovation out of the country. That's also a reason why many Americans who are wanting to build crypto businesses have left the country to other places. So that is probably fueling also the interest in these new startup societies as alternatives that can also hopefully in the end put pressure on policymakers in the United States, right? Because the United States has been and still is in some ways one of the most innovative countries in the world, right? So why would you let that innovation go elsewhere, right? So we want to use a bit the power of embarrassment to also inspire change and reform in the United States, right? So I personally think there is hope. I'm generally very like I came to this country in 2013 for the first time with like very high aspirations and hopes and the American dream. And I think that can still be intact, right, in ways. And if we can sort of improve in the right ways and use some of these startup societies as experimental ground to look what's happening there that we can do in the United States as well.
That's a perfect tee up for the next video, which is going to be Representative Emmer, who in many ways is like the opposite of Elizabeth Warren as a political leader addressing this
Very
issue of
supportive
Web3.
of his work, and I feel very honored to have come before
You're
talking.
kind of opening for him here. But let's end by addressing the audience. So we have like what does this mean for an auditorium of law students, existing lawyers, and other business professionals? Like, is this a whole new? This sounds to me, as a non-lawyer, as a whole new world of law that an attorney could get behind, find a new career path in, or something like that. And not to mention the other business opportunities that you yourself invest in.
Yeah, I think if you're a lawyer, this is a really, really exciting time for you. Right. So to point out or to give a shout out to my friends at LexDAO, which is a guild of lawyers that are interested in crypto and Web3 and that are effectively combining law with computer science. Right. So law has code-like properties. Right. So this thing, it's basically a bunch of if-then statements. And that coupled with the opportunity to shape the laws in new jurisdictions and to think from a first principles basis, how could law function in different ways rather than taking the existing law and regulatory book as a given, something that you can only change like once every like 10 years or something like that. Only if you can achieve high power and influence in Washington. That's not the case anymore. If you're a ambitious lawyer that is very interested in these topics in these startup societies, there is a huge need for innovative lawyers that want to think from a first principles basis. How can legal systems function differently? Like they are the protocol of society, basically, just like software, right? On which other things are built on top of them, right? So you see that in the difference between the United States and sort of poorer nations in the world, or generally poorer and richer nations. It's often the difference is legal, right? So, and the ability to build institutions on top of these legal protocols. So this should be very exciting this should be very exciting for you. And I'm certainly very excited about it. And I wasn't excited about law before this. And now I feel like my knowledge about law has become a real superpower.
We're recording this a few days before our conference, but I'm going to go out on a limb and predict that the very sentiment that you just expressed about law as code and the blending of the two is going to be the very, like some of that phrasing is going to be almost word for word what we hear in the morning session. So this also serves as a wonderful bookend here at the end of the day, at the end of the conference. So well done with those thoughts here at the end of this conversation. Niklas, thanks so much. How could people reach out, find you, ask you follow-up questions?
Sure, just find me on Twitter, Niklas Anzinger, Niklas Anzinger. I'm also very active on LinkedIn under the same name, and also check out my podcast, the Stranded Technology Podcast, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, where you find several podcast episodes also around the topics that we discussed. For example, Tom W. Bell, episode 7, talks very much as law as the protocol layer of society, and he's also been someone who's been designing legal systems for these startup societies. So that should be a very good intro into that space to look further.
Boy, I have to say, I've had the impression for a long time here watching laws try to keep up with technology. And like in the US, they tried to make 3D printed gun schematics illegal. And when a Florida senator announced that they passed the law, he did so with by exclaiming, "We did it!" And the very first tweet below his tweet, the first response was a link to the schematic. Like, dude, you can't stop this. So I've tended to see law as really behind technology, but I love what you're saying here. It's like law as we've practiced it is behind, but now law will emerge, I guess, and create a whole new foundation basis for societies of tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Very exciting times to be alive, and you're in the right field for sure.
Thanks, Niklas, so much for your time. Appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brandon, and thanks everyone in the audience for listening.